It was noontime in the city of Jerusalem. The temple school for boys had been dismissed. Daniel and his 3 special friends were hurrying home to lunch when suddenly a trumpet sounded. At home, Daniel's mother served him pulse for lunch. Pulse is food like beans and vegetables, brown bread, berries, and dates. Daniel liked pulse. Pulse would make him grow tall. Pulse would make him grow strong. Pulse would make him get good grades in school. The king of Babylon sat on his royal throne while soldiers paraded the prisoners before him. Said the king to the captain of the army,
"Choose boys from among the prisoners, goodly boys. Give them food for my table to eat, and give them of my wine to drink. They shall go to school for 3 years to learn the wisdom of Babylon."
Daniel and his 3 friends were chosen. Prince Melzar was given charge over all the boys. That evening, Daniel and his friends talked together.
"We cannot eat the king's food,"
Said Daniel.
"It has been offered to idols. And besides, the king's food is not the best food for boys. Neither can we drink the king's wine."
"What shall we do?" the boys asked one another. Then Daniel thought of a plan.
"Let's ask Melzar to give us pulse to eat and water to drink instead of the king's food and wine."
"It's a good plan," agreed the 3 friends. Daniel and his friends went to see Prince Melzar. They bowed politely, then asked for pulse and water instead of the king's food and wine. Melzar shook his head.
"No. If the king should see you looking thinner than the other boys and learn that I've given you pulse and water, he might even cut off my head."
"Please try us for 10 days, begged Daniel. So Melzar agreed to give them pulse and water for 10 days.
"Then we shall see,"
he said. Although Daniel and his friends were far from home, and there was no sound of a ram's horn trumpet to remind them, they did not forget to pray. Morning, noon, and night, Daniel opened his window toward the temple back in Jerusalem and prayed to the God of heaven. He asked God to bless the pulse and water and to please let it make them strong, so that Melzar might know that pulse and water were better for the boys than the king's food and wine. When the 10 days had passed, Prince Melzar called all the boys before him. He looked at their faces. He felt their arms. He found that Daniel and his friends were fairer and fatter than the boys who had ate the king's food and wine. So, even after, during 3 years of school, Prince Melzar gave Daniel and his friends pulse to eat and water to drink. 1, 2, 3 years went by. School was over for Daniel and his friends. They had grown taller. Had they grown wiser? The king himself would test them. Daniel and his friends, dressed in clean clothes, with hair combed and sandals polished, stood before the king of Babylon. The king asked them question after question, and lo, the king found Daniel and his 3 friends 10 times wiser than all the wise men of Babylon.
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
So I bet you didn't know that Daniel chapter 1 is teaching us that Daniel was a vegetarian and you should be too. So says the SDA Church in their My Bible Friends children's book series, specifically the one on Daniel, the goal of which is to teach kids that Daniel was stronger, healthier, and smarter than all those other little pagan Babylonian kids because he was a vegetarian, which can be seen in this image where the artist went to great lengths to make all the other kids look gaunt and like they have jaundice. But there's one major problem with this. No, it's not just their weaseling in as well of the SDA temperance ideas of always having your hair combed and your shoes polished, etc. Daniel wasn't a vegetarian that lived on water and pulse. This much is made clear in the 10th chapter of Daniel, which states that Daniel fasted for 3 weeks, wherein he ate no delicacies, no meat or wine for 3 weeks. So he was fasting, which would mean that by definition, Daniel did eat meat and drink wine at some point, because in order to fast from something, one must normally be partaking of said thing. Daniel was also a faithful Jew that would have partaken of the Passover lamb on a number of occasions, which was commanded by God. Even SDA scholarship such as Angel Rodriguez from the SDA Biblical Research Institute was forced to recognize this, where in a paper titled Daniel 10:3, Was Daniel a Vegetarian? He writes, "For Daniel, only the Lord could determine what he would eat. In that setting, he went back to the original diet that excluded meat and helped him be obedient to the Lord. And the Lord blessed his effort to serve him. When he was in charge of his own diet, he followed the Levitical regulations." Ah, right. Because Mr. Rodriguez recognizes that Daniel was fasting, and Daniel 1 has nothing to do with being a vegetarian, which results in being smarter and wiser than everyone else. This is being read into the story from somewhere else. So if it isn't coming from Scripture, where could this idea possibly... In her book, In Heavenly Places, Ellen White comments on Daniel 1:8, where she speaks about Daniel and his friends' decision to reject the king's food and wine, but unlike Mr. Rodriguez, she claims that flesh meat had not composed Daniel and his friends' diet in the past, nor would it come into their diet in the future. Well, I want to thank Angel Rodriguez for his recognition that Ellen White contradicts the Bible in this area, a contradiction that is published by the SDA Church and misleads children by teaching them that following the SDA health message will lead to getting better grades, being smarter than other non-Adventist kids, and that Daniel took a stand for being a vegetarian in the face of cultural pressure. By this point, are you starting to question the legitimacy of the commandment-keeping church being the commandment-keeping church? They'll even lie to children to uphold Ellen White even when their own scholarship and theologians recognize it's false, and shame on them. Which reminds me, you'll want to check this out as well.